had that to show for it, you know. And then I met Chris. My health challenges happened. I was diagnosed with some health challenges, and then I met Chris. I met Chris because of those health challenges. My friend sent me a friend suggestion for him. It was actually his cousin's wife, and I deleted it. I was like, I am not interested. I don't want to meet a guy. Bye-bye. So I deleted her friend's suggestion for him. I was diagnosed 2 months later, and I went through one of the, I would say, darkest times of my life, because things just got scarier, worse. I thought my life was crumbling underneath me, and I didn't know which way to turn. I didn't have a lot of friends at the time, because a lot of my friends, the friends I did have, I lost because they didn't understand that I looked perfectly fine.
If you believe every victim deserves to be remembered and every truth deserves to be told, subscribe to The Crime Narrator. These stories live on because you're here to hear them.
Before anyone knew his name, before the headlines and the courtroom photos, Chris Watts was just another man blending into the background. Quiet, soft-spoken, the kind of person neighbors described as polite, almost forgettable. He waved, he smiled, he went to work, and he came home. From the outside, his life looked ordinary. Married, 2 young daughters, a house in a quiet Colorado neighborhood, another baby on the way. Nothing about him suggested violence, let alone the kind of brutality that would later shock the world. And yet, buried beneath that carefully maintained image was a truth Chris Watts would one day speak out loud. A sentence so cold it redefined everything that came before it. I never loved Shanann. At first, the statement doesn't just sound cruel, it sounds impossible. How could someone marry a person, build a family, share years of memories, and claim there was never love? But to understand how Chris Watts could say those words, you have to go back to the beginning, long before the crime, long before the confessions, to the man he was before anyone was looking closely. Chris often described himself as passive, even as a child. He avoided conflict. He followed rules. He did what was expected of him. Friends and family said he wasn't dominant or outspoken. Instead, he let others lead while he stayed quiet. When he met Shanann, that pattern continued. She was energetic, ambitious, outspoken, everything he was not. To outsiders, they looked like opposites that somehow fit. Shanann documented their life online, posting photos and videos that painted a picture of happiness, love, and a growing family. Chris appeared in those posts smiling, compliant, present. But presence is not the same as connection. Years later, Chris would claim that from the very start, he felt emotionally detached. He said he went along with the relationship because it was easier than resisting it. He didn't argue. He didn't express doubt. He didn't walk away. Instead, he performed the role of a husband while suppressing his own emotions, or perhaps never developing them in the first place. It's uncomfortable to hear, because it forces a question many people don't want to ask. How many relationships exist where one person is simply playing a part? As you're listening to this, if you find yourself drawn into these quiet details, the kind that don't scream danger but whisper it, take a moment to like this video. It helps stories like this reach more people, not for shock, but for understanding how these crimes unfold long before they make the news. Chris Watts didn't describe explosive fights or constant chaos. Instead, he spoke about resentment that built silently. He said he felt controlled, overshadowed, emasculated. But rather than confronting those feelings, he buried them. And buried emotions don't disappear, they ferment. They turn into something else. What makes this case especially disturbing is how normal everything looked while that resentment grew unchecked. When investigators later asked about his marriage, Chris didn't speak with the grief you might expect. His words were flat, almost rehearsed. He talked about routines, obligations, and pressure, but rarely about love. And when the truth finally surfaced, when the mask slipped, it wasn't revealed in a dramatic outburst. It came quietly, almost casually, as if he were stating a simple fact. I never loved Shanann. That sentence reframes the entire story. It casts a shadow backward over every smile, every family photo, every public display of affection. It forces us to reconsider whether the life he lived was real, or just a performance maintained to avoid conflict and accountability. And it raises a chilling possibility that the absence of love didn't start with the affair or the murders, but existed all along. If you're new here and you appreciate long-form, carefully narrated true crime stories that focus on psychology rather than just headlines, consider subscribing and sharing this video. These stories matter, not because of the killer, but because understanding them may help recognize warning signs before it's too late. By the time Chris Watts uttered those words, Shanann no longer had a voice to respond. The confession didn't explain the crime. It stripped it bare. And as the story continues, that single sentence will echo louder, revealing not just what Chris did, but who he may have always been. The room where Chris Watts finally began to unravel the truth was small, quiet, and unforgiving. No crowds, no cameras, just fluorescent lights, plain walls, and questions he could no longer outrun. By this point, the image of the concerned husband had already collapsed, replaced by a man cornered by evidence. And yet, even as the truth pressed in on him, Chris didn't erupt. He didn't plead. He didn't rage. He spoke softly, choosing his words carefully, as if the right phrasing might still protect him from what he had done. It was during these interrogations and later in prison interviews that Chris first said the words that would permanently alter how the world understood this case. He didn't shout them. He didn't choke on them. He said them plainly. I never loved Shanann. The statement landed with a dull finality, not because it was emotional, but because it wasn't. There was no visible grief attached to it, no shame in the admission. It sounded less like a confession and more like a revision of history. As Chris spoke, he began reconstructing his marriage in a way that centered himself as a victim of circumstance. He described Shanann as controlling, dominant, overwhelming. He portrayed himself as someone who had lost his voice, trapped in a life he didn't choose but also never refused. The narrative was subtle but dangerous. By reframing his marriage as emotional imprisonment, Chris attempted to soften the perception of his actions without directly justifying them. It was a quiet deflection, and it worked on some people who were desperate to understand how a father could become a killer. But psychologists point out that this kind of storytelling is common among offenders who lack emotional accountability. Instead of acknowledging internal flaws, emotional emptiness, resentment, narcissism, Chris externalized blame. He spoke about pressure, expectations, and unhappiness, yet rarely addressed his own choices. The words, I never loved Shanann, became a shield, a way to explain the unexplainable without confronting the deeper truth that love was never the issue. Control was. As the interviews continued, another figure entered the narrative. Nicole Kessinger. Chris spoke about her differently. There was excitement in his voice, energy that had been absent when he discussed his family. But even here, the pattern remained. He didn't describe deep emotional connection. He described freedom, less responsibility, less pressure, less performance. The affair didn't create the emptiness, it exposed it. And when Chris said he finally felt alive, what he was really admitting was that he had been emotionally vacant long before. If you're finding yourself unsettled by how calmly these confessions were delivered, you're not alone. Stories like this force us to confront uncomfortable realities about emotional detachment and hidden resentment. If you value deep-dive crime narratives that examine the psychology behind the headlines, this is a good time to subscribe and share the story so others can engage with it thoughtfully. What makes Chris Watts particularly disturbing is not just what he did, but how he talked about it afterward. He spoke in practical terms. He compartmentalized. He minimized. Even when discussing the moment everything fell apart, his focus drifted back to how trapped he felt, how overwhelmed he was, how his life had spiraled out of control. Missing from these reflections was genuine empathy for Shanann and as a person, not just as a symbol of a life he wanted to escape. When Chris declared he never loved his wife, he wasn't just rewriting his marriage. He was attempting to strip it of meaning. Because if there was no love, then there was no betrayal. If there was no emotional bond, then the loss could be framed as tragic but impersonal. It was a psychological shortcut, one that allowed him to speak without fully feeling the weight of his actions. By the end of these confessions, It became clear that the statement wasn't a revelation. It was a warning sign that had been ignored for years. Love, in this case, was never absent suddenly. It was never present at all. And as the story moves forward, that realization forces a darker question. If love was never there, then what, exactly, was holding this family together until it all collapsed? When Chris Watts was finally sentenced and the doors of the prison closed behind him, many people believed the story had reached its end. Justice, in its legal form, had been delivered, but the psychological weight of his words lingered long after the courtroom emptied. I never loved Shanann became more than a confession. It became the lens through which every moment of the past was re-examined. Family photos, home videos, cheerful social media posts all took on a darker meaning, as the public tried to reconcile the life that appeared so full with the emptiness Chris later described. For Shanann's family, that sentence carried a cruelty beyond measure. It was not enough that she and her children were gone. Now the foundation of her marriage was being publicly erased by the man who ended it. The idea that years of shared experiences could be dismissed so casually struck many as a final act of violence, one that could not be undone by a prison sentence. Investigators, too, were left with a chilling realization. Not that Chris had snapped, but that he had been emotionally absent for years, hiding behind routine and obedience. From behind bars, Chris continued to talk. He spoke about faith, about forgiveness, about personal transformation. But even in these later reflections, a pattern remained. The narrative often circled back to him, his struggles, his awakening, his pain. Shanann's voice was absent, reduced to a role in his story rather than a life cut short. And this, perhaps more than anything, revealed the depth of the emotional void at the center of the case. If you believe telling these stories matters, if you believe remembering victims and understanding warning signs can make a difference, take a moment to like this video and share it. These conversations keep the focus where it belongs, on truth, accountability, and the lives that were taken. What makes this case resonate years later is not just its brutality, but its familiarity. There was no dramatic collapse visible from the outside. No screaming matches caught on tape. No obvious warning that a family was in danger. Instead, there was silence, compliance, smiles without substance. Chris Watts showed the world how emotional emptiness can hide behind normalcy, how resentment can grow unchecked when a person lacks the ability or willingness to confront it. The sentence, "I never loved Shanann," does not explain what happened. It does not justify it. It exposes it. It reveals a man who lived without genuine connection, who mistook obedience for intimacy and avoidance for peace. And when the performance no longer served him, he didn't walk away. He erased the people who anchored that life. As this story comes to a close, the focus must return to Shanann and her children, not as footnotes in a killer's narrative, but as real lives with voices that were silenced. Remembering them means looking beyond the surface of relationships that appear perfect, and recognizing that the most dangerous warning signs are often the quietest. If you're still here, and you value thoughtful, long-form true crime storytelling that prioritizes understanding over spectacle, consider subscribing to the channel. Every story told is a reminder that behind every headline is a human cost, and behind every confession is a truth that should never be ignored.